Good morning. I'm really excited to see you here this morning, particularly after having the party late last night. I was unsure whether anyone would be able to get up this early and be ready to hear about Metro-style apps in HTML5. So really, thank you for coming. Thank you for showing up and giving me an audience to present to. I really appreciate it. So I know that many of you have been excited about this Build conference to hear what we've got to say about Metro-style applications, and I hope that so far you've been hearing a lot of really great information that really applies to your development world. I know that I'm personally excited about this conference, and apparently there's a lot of exciting things going on because I heard there was an earthquake yesterday. Did anybody hear about that? Anyone? Yep, a couple of people. Anyone feel it? A few people felt it. I think more people were rattled up north from here, from what's going on here at the conference, than perhaps the earthquake in this area, but we'll see. Okay, so I'm excited about this conference and about the story we have to tell for a few different reasons, some of which are professional, some of which are personal. And I kind of want to tell you a little bit about my own history so that you understand why I'm so excited about it. I first came to Microsoft back in 1993, so I'm dating myself a little bit. But when I came to Microsoft, I joined the Windows team, and while I'd written some C code, I'd never written a Windows application, and I thought, well, gosh, yeah, I'm excited, I'm new on the team, I should really learn how to write a Windows application. And so, with great enthusiasm, I dove in and learned about message pumps and subclassing Windows and doing all the cool things that you could do back then with the Win32 SDK. Anybody recall those days? Anybody write C? Oh, yep, okay, you guys are my heroes. That was quite an accomplishment. And over the years, Microsoft has done a number of things to, in fact, make it much easier to build Windows applications than it was back in those early days, as satisfying as it was to actually get those apps up and running. So we've introduced new languages, we've introduced new frameworks, but really it's never been as easy and as fast as it is for so many developers to participate in the Windows application ecosystem. And so we're really excited to tell this story. Now that's sort of my professional excitement. My personal excitement is, back when I first joined the company, my son was 3 years old and had just begun to kind of play around with his own computer and move the mouse around and really didn't understand what was going on. My son today is 21. And he is a web developer, he is a phone developer, and he's in fact here at the conference. He's sitting here in the first row. Raise your hand, Paul. So I'm excited that my son gets the opportunity to participate and to learn how to write Windows applications without nearly the level of complexity and pain that some of us went through in those early days. So I'm excited to see the applications that my son Paul is going to build, and I'm really excited to see the applications that each of you are going to build on this new platform. In fact, I was hearing from some of the conference attendees already that they've already done things like port Silverlight applications to this new model. They've already ported some of their web code over, and they're beginning to learn what the opportunities are and what the value is in this new platform that we've created. So I'm excited. Let's get started. So again, just to introduce myself, my name is John Hazen. I'm a principal program manager lead in the Windows team. Our team is responsible for building the platform that's enabled Metro-style applications to be built in HTML5. And when I say HTML5, really you should hear the collection of technologies associated with HTML5. So CSS, JavaScript, all of those things, I use them somewhat interchangeably. So if I say HTML5 or if I say JavaScript, just assume I'm referring to all of these things. Okay, so customers have some high expectations for Metro-style apps. They expect them to be connected to the local platform. That's why we've provided the Windows runtime. But they also expect them to be connected applications and allow them to interact with other people in the cloud, on the web. So for instance, you could build a really cool game just using the Windows runtime, but if that game doesn't allow you to look at leaderboards or post your score to a social network, it's not going to be as interesting and as compelling as it could be. And so customers really want and expect applications that make use of the Windows runtime and the power of the local platform and make use of the dynamic content we all know and love out on the web. And so when we thought about both the challenges and opportunities of blending these capabilities in a single application, we thought, we could go invent whole new ways of interacting in these applications that you would have to go and learn. But we thought, as we're building support for these various languages and technologies, we wanted to build new capabilities that would really be natural and familiar to people who understood these technologies already. So those of you who are web developers, are you JavaScript? A few of you? So some of this is going to be very familiar to you as I walk through the concepts that I'm building on in order to integrate this kind of content into a Metro-style application. For others of you, some of it will be a little bit new, and I'll walk through those concepts in detail. But for those of you who are familiar with web development already, you'll see how we've built on familiar concepts to provide new capabilities. So I'm going to walk through some of the slides that lay out these concepts and how we've built on these familiar technologies. But then we're really going to dive very quickly into demo, and I'll walk you through some of the code to show you how we integrate both the Windows runtime and dynamic web content in a Metro-style app using HTML5. And so you're going to walk away from this session with examples, very concrete examples of exactly how you should go do this in your own application, what the kind of models are that you should follow to integrate this content. And we're also going to see some examples of how you authenticate to some of these great services using OAuth. There were some examples shown in the keynote, particularly in the server keynote. We'll walk through some of that again, so you have a second chance to see that. Okay, let's dive in. So the Windows runtime, you've heard a lot about the Windows runtime, and I'm not going to repeat a number of the details that you may have heard from the keynotes or from other sessions. But what I want you to get from this slide is that the runtime is easy and powerful, and what it represents is really access to things that are on the user's machine that they really care about. It's the user's data. It's their location. It's their images, their pictures, their webcam. It's things that they really care about. And you want to build applications that make use of these things, but at the same time, you want to respect the confidence that users have placed in you. They've entrusted you to have access to these capabilities on their machine, to their photo library, to their documents, to their webcam, to their location, and they expect you to treat that confidence very carefully. And if you don't, their confidence is going to be undermined. They'll lower the ratings of your applications in the store, and that's not what any of us want. So the Windows runtime, it's easy and it's powerful, and it gives you access to things that the user really cares about. At the same time, as I said before, users also, at the same time that they want you to have access to their local resources so you can produce interesting and useful applications that interact with their data and their machine, they really want them to be connected as well. And so you've heard a lot of sessions here about the power of the web, internet services, messaging, lots of cool talks about Azure, lots of different ways in which you want to connect your application to other people, to other services, even to other applications on the same platform. So, that presents an interesting opportunity and an interesting challenge. And I'm sure that none of you would make the kinds of mistakes I make. I'm constantly making mistakes, don't tell my boss. But let's say I heard this message, and I get all excited about the fact that I can connect to devices in my application using JavaScript. Well, that's cool. You've got these new tablets, right? I unfortunately don't have a new tablet myself, but this new tablet's got a lot of cool sensors and hardware in it. One of the things that it's able to do is connect to SMS. There's SMS device in that tablet. And so I think to myself, gosh, I've got an HTML application I'd like to write, and I'd like to connect to that SMS device and be able to receive messages and display that in my Metro-style app. That'd be cool. I want to go do that. And so I go ahead and attach that device and put a listener on it so that as new messages come in, I get an event and I get the message data. And what's the natural way for me to insert that message into my application? Well, I'm kind of a novice at this, so I'll use inner HTML. Now, some of you are scratching your head a little bit about why would you use inner HTML instead of some of the other options. Others of you are going like, well, that sounds good to me. Well, let me show you why that may be a challenge. So here's my SMS application. SMS stands for a Simple Message Simulator, doesn't it? Well, like I said, I don't have the tablet that you have, and so my machine doesn't actually have SMS hardware, so I couldn't actually attach to the device. But I am simulating the exact same operation here, where I can enter a message to send that my application is then going to display, and I'm going to use an inner HTML call to display it in that message received box. Let's see how that works. Good morning, build. Can you guys say good morning, John? I need to know that you're there. Good morning, John. Ah, good. You are there. Excellent. Okay, so that seems to work great. You know, now I know I'm simulating it here, but imagine I've actually connected to that SMS device on my machine, and I've received a message, and I've displayed it in my application. Awesome. Things are working great. The problem is I didn't anticipate that David here, who's a little bit sketchy, might actually realize that that's presented an opportunity for him to insert code into my application. And so he pulls out his phone and he sends me this SMS message. Hey, John, I'm going to mess up your demo right now. I'm going to send you this message. And now what do we have? In this simple text message that he sent me, we've got a div statement, and in that div statement, there's this onMouseOver event that I'm handling, and it's going to call this function called hackMe. Well, hackMe is a little function in my own application here, but that could easily be a reference off to some other source that was in fact much more malicious. Well, what happens in this case when I've done the inner HTML call? Well, when I send that message, it says danger. That should give me a clue that perhaps something's wrong here. So David's been nice and actually warned me that something bad might happen. But I don't really see anything else that would give me a clue about what the problem is. So when I move my mouse over it, it actually registers that onClick event and calls that hackMe function. Well, that's not good. He sent me some code in an SMS message that now, because of the way I wrote the application, he's actually able to exploit my application. Well, it's a good thing that I at least put that in an iframe so it constrains how much damage he could do as an attacker on my platform. But gosh, I feel really stupid. I never imagined that someone would send me this kind of data in my application. Come on, I was just trying to provide a neat feature for my customers, and he's gone and ruined it for everyone. Okay, so this is the problem that we're trying to address, because none of us would intentionally write code that would introduce this kind of vulnerability in an application. None of us intentionally write buffer overruns in our C code either. But people find ways of getting their code running in your application. And remember, your users, your customers have trusted you with their local data. And if you allow other people, other third parties, to inject code into your application, that's going to undermine their confidence. So I want to talk a bit about what we've done in the platform to actually help you do the right things along the way. So that was my demo, my inner HTML call demo. We'll skip that slide. So the fundamental question is really, who do you trust? In this case, I was a little too trusting. I assumed that anybody who sent me a text message would just send me a normal text and wouldn't actually try and exploit my application. Now I know better. There's some bad people out there. David, I'm watching you. David's giving the talk in the next hour on security best practices in HTML, so you'll want to talk to him next. But he knows all these evil tricks. Okay, so I've learned that maybe I can't actually trust everyone. So who do I trust? Who do you trust? This is the same challenge that you have as you're writing websites today. You have to think about how you incorporate other people's content into your website in a safe way. And so you kind of have this mental distinction between content that you trust. This is content you generated, whether it's code or other content. You generated it, you tested it, and you're pretty sure that you're not trying to hurt yourself. So you guys, well, most of you look trustworthy. I don't think that you're being, intentionally malicious. It's those other people that are really suspicious. And then there's content you don't trust quite so much. You're a little bit cautious about using in your application, because you don't really know where that content and where that code is coming from. And it could contain simply innocent mistakes. You could cut and paste code. You could allow other people to send you data. All of these different things could just be innocent errors that could then cause either a reliability or a security problem in your application. And then there's also the risk, as we noted, of people who have malicious intent who are intending to undermine the confidence that customers could have in your application. And so we want to find ways of protecting ourselves from this untrusted content. Well, again, like I said before, we didn't want to invent brand new ways that would be unfamiliar to a web developer for handling this kind of problem. And so what do you do on the web? You wrap, one of the most common things to do anyway, is to wrap untrusted content in an iframe. Again, just like I did in my demo application a few minutes ago, I put it in an iframe, which limited the risk associated with someone else inserting dynamic content into my application. And that's the same thing that you do on the web today. Well, we thought about, how can we extend that iframe concept for Metro-style apps using HTML5? Here's what we came up with. As you've heard, Metro-style applications are packaged. There's a certain set of content that's put together in what is essentially a zip file that gets delivered to the store, is digitally signed, and is delivered by the store and installed by the platform, and is well-trusted code. We know exactly who wrote that code. We know that it's been well-tested. We trust you guys. You're the ones who are developing these applications. And we call that trusted content. It's coming from the local package. And by definition, if what's in the local package is trusted content, then everything that's not in that local package should, in fact, be untrusted content. And so we really use this iframe concept to enable you to distinguish between that trusted content and the untrusted content. And so the way that you reference your code and the content in your application really determines how we treat that content. So you may have seen, or it may be new for you here today, this protocol name ms-www-a. That's the mechanism that we use, just like HTTP, but to reference local packaged content. And you'll see that there's 3 slashes after it. That's not actually a typo. That's actually the way that you reference the root location of the package wherever it was installed on the user's system. It's a shortcut, much like the file protocol is able to do the same thing to refer to the root. So if content in your application is loaded and referred to using ms-www-a, it runs in one context. If it's loaded using HTTP, we know it's coming from some remote location, wasn't part of your package, and should be treated slightly differently. Well, we have names for these things, and we have some characteristics for them. We call them local context and web context. And so, in order to describe exactly how this works, I'd like to divide the room up, if you will. Don't worry, I won't make you get up and move seats or anything. But this half of the room, you guys are going to be local context, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how you work and how you operate. You guys, kind of from the center of the room this way, you get to be web context. So I'm going to talk to those guys first, so you guys can pull out your tablets and play around with some of the games, and really don't bother listening to what I tell them, okay? Because it's not important. Okay, you guys need to actually pay attention now. So look up from your email and look me in the eye, and I want you to know something. I want you to know you're my favorite. Okay, I like you guys the best because you're in that local package, because I trust you, because you're digitally signed. You guys, I think, are awesome. And I'm going to give you some privileges, and I'm going to give you some help. The privileges I'm going to give you are to call the Windows runtime. You guys get full access to whatever you've declared in your application to access on the user's machine. If you want to declare the picture library, you get to use the picture library. And really, it's because you're my favorite. I like you guys. You're awesome. I'm also going to do some things to help you avoid that kind of problem that I showed you earlier where I made this novice mistake with inner HTML. And I'm going to help you manage some of this script that comes from that comes from the internet that we'll worry about in web context, because actually I said earlier that you guys didn't, those guys look a little bit suspicious to me. So you really shouldn't quite trust those guys. So you guys are my favorite. Just remember that. Okay. Now you guys need to look up from your tablets again, and don't worry about what I told them. Really, you guys are my favorite. Like I said before, you guys are really what make Metro-style applications interesting and valuable to users. Metro-style application that plays around with local data is not nearly as interesting and valuable as a Metro-style app that's connected and alive. Jensen in his keynote talked about alive with activity. Remember his whole reference to snakes and spiders and all that kind of cool stuff. I personally like snakes. They're kind of fun. Not everybody does, but we do like our applications to be alive with activity, and you guys are the ones who actually enable that to be true. And so I love you guys. You guys are awesome. You're the best. Don't tell them that. Shh, don't listen. It's really not true. Okay. So because I like you the best, I'm going to do some special things for you. I know that you want to run exactly the way you run in the browser. Your services, your resources, your capabilities, you may not even know that you're going to be used in the context of a Metro-style app, so why should I make you do something special for this new platform that we've created? You want to work in a browser, you want to work in Metro-style apps, you want to work on all kinds of devices, and so I'm going to respect the fact that you want that standards-based interface, and I'm going to treat you exactly the way I would treat you in the browser. Now again, because you're running as if you were running in the browser, you don't have access to the Windows runtime, but that's okay. Most of the cases, you wouldn't have access to the Windows runtime either. If you're running in the browser, you don't need access to the Windows runtime. You've got the W3C APIs for some of the interactions that you want to enable on your user's machine, but for the most part, you're good to go. And so we give you the standard name, it's HTTP. They get some other weird name that you have to learn. You guys are really awesome. And in fact, you guys are so awesome that sometimes those guys actually want to be more like you. And I know they're a little bit odd, but sometimes you need to welcome them into your context as well. And you guys, I've given you a way to do that relatively easily. Here's my clicker. So let's talk about that. So I told you that the way that you load from a local package is ms-dub-dub-a. That's well and good. We load you up in a local context. You get access to the Windows runtime. But sometimes you, in fact, do want to interact in a richer way with the folks on the other side of the room here in web context. And so you want to participate more in their world. But you want to load your content from your local package. Well, how do you do that? Well, it's very easy. Instead of referring to yourself as ms-dub-dub-a, you append -web. So if you load your local content from your local package, your signed package, but reference it using ms-dub-dub-a web, well, then you get all the benefits of running in a standards-based world with no restrictions on interacting with remote script, just like the web context guys do. And there's some valuable scenarios where you're going to want to do that, and this is a pattern that you're going to want to follow. And I've got some examples here in a minute that we will walk through to show you exactly how that works. Well, now we've got an interesting challenge because I've divided the room up, and I've created these guys over here that are running in local context, these guys over here that are running in web context. You're a little bit suspicious of each other at this point, but customers expect both of you to work together to create an interesting and compelling application and experience in this Metro-style world. So how do we do that? Well, once again, we could have gone off and invented some special new way that these two contexts interact with each other, but what's the standard mechanism for communicating between iframes in the W3C? It's post message. And so we allow post message between these two contexts as well, and this is the way that you glue your application together, you tie web context and local context so you can complete these scenarios that enable these great customer experiences. So post message is the mechanism you use to communicate between local context and web context, and I'll walk you through what that looks like in some samples. Now, I mentioned a few minutes ago that there's some restrictions in the local context about how we handle script. And I say restrictions here, but really what I'm talking about is watching your back. Watching out for those simple mistakes like I made earlier. It's our point of view that in Metro-style applications, when you're running in local context and you've got access to these rich resources that customers have entrusted you with, we should have some behaviors that by default are more cautious about including script content so that customers don't have a bad experience with your application. And so what do? Well, with inner HTML and the related calls, those of you who are familiar with this includes outer HTML, insert adjacent HTML, document.write, and there's a list of them. Those calls are monitored for the inclusion of script. So you might not expect script to be included in one of these calls, but if we detect that the script is present, we're actually going to block that call. And I'll show you an example of what that looks like in just a minute. But our intent is really to block accidental inclusion of script. We don't want to prevent you from doing this ever. There's valuable cases where, in fact, you do want to do an inner HTML call and include script in your DOM. Well, we give you a way to do that, and I'll show you how that looks in the code. The final thing that you should be aware of is that you can't do a script reference off to an HTTP source. Because remember, if you're referencing HTTP, that's what we have web context for. And you're welcome to use HTTP references in your script tags, but in that context, you need to load your content using that ms-www-web so that you're running in a web context so that you can interact in rich ways with those remote scripts. And I'll walk you through exactly what that looks like. Okay, that's most of my slides, so we're going to dive into some demos here and some code. Switch back to my demo machine. This is where we left off with my simple message simulator, and I'm going to reset this. And I'm going to reveal another portion of this application. Now, I've talked to you about web context and local context in your application and how we control that using iframes. So let me actually show you what I mean. This portion of my application that's loading from my local package is in fact loaded in a local context. The reference there is to ms-wwa default.html. This is the primary web page that's loaded when my application starts. And by default, your application loads in local context. As you may guess, the other portion of my application is running in web context. So the rules that apply to that iframe are going to be different than the rules that apply to the other iframe. Let me show you how that works out in practice. So if I hide those overlay messages, and we send a simple message again. Cool stuff, John. Looks exactly the same in both web context and in local context. Well, that's because we're not preventing inner HTML calls at all. We're just preventing inner HTML calls that accidentally include script. And in this particular message, there's no script, so there's really no effect on that inner HTML call at all. Let's look and see what happens if I actually include an unsafe message. Now I'm back to that onMouseOver event where you saw in the local context, it actually allowed an attacker to take over that iframe. In the local context, that call is actually blocked now because the platform has detected, oh, there's script content in this block that you're trying to insert in your application, in your DOM. It's got script. That's not allowed. You didn't signal to me that that was your intent to do that. So by default, I'm going to block it. This is one of the key differences between local context and web context. And if you're not careful and aware of what these different contexts are, this is something that you're going to trip over. So when you're writing your code and in your application and you start getting these kinds of exceptions, I want you to remember, oh, yeah, that talk I went to at Build explained all of this. I didn't really understand it all at the time, but I'm beginning to get it now, and you can go back and watch the content again, and it will begin to click and make sense for you. So we're helping you here by blocking any accidental inclusion of script in your inner HTML calls or any of the related calls. Well, that's all well and good, John, but what about when I actually want to do some of these things? Well, let me show you what some of the other options are. And I'll send a safe message. Hey, please go get, please get milk on the way home. It's a typical SMS message that I get. So I'm a long way from home, so I'm probably not going to pick it up tonight. But often stop on the way home and pick up things from the store. In this case, I show you several different options here, some of which are going to look very familiar to you. Again, we're trying to build on familiar and natural mechanisms that are used on the web today, and will continue to work in Metro-style apps using HTML5. But there's some other options there that are going to look less familiar. In this particular example, all of these actually look identical. So, John, what's interesting? Why do we have all of these different options? Well, it's because we want to give you flexibility in a variety of circumstances. So let me show you a different message. Let's suppose I send a message that's got some HTML content in it, just some simple bold tags, but it's actually not dangerous content because it's not script that's going to be executed. Let's see what happens when I actually send this message and incorporate that into my application. Now we're beginning to see some differences between these different ways of inserting content into my application. Most of these look the same because there's no dynamic content, no dynamic scripts that are being inserted into the application. But inner.text, which again is going to be familiar to most of you and probably what I actually should have used in my SMS application in the first place, inner.text begins to show the difference because it converts those HTML tags to simple text, and instead of rendering them as HTML, it just renders them as text. That neutralizes the effect of any of those tags and would in fact neutralize the effect of any scripts that were inserted in that as well. So it's a very safe way to include content in your application. This gets more interesting when we actually move to relatively unsafe content. Here, I'll just reset it so we clear those. I'll put the unsafe content back in, and I'll send that. Now we actually see that each one of these operations are in fact very, very different. Again, since I've put the dynamic script content back in my message, that default inner HTML behavior is showing up again where I in fact block the ability to include dynamic content in that operation. Inner text, as I explained a few minutes ago, is in fact converting that to very safe text content that's not going to get executed. So while you see all of the script content there, none of it's in fact being executed. The third option that you see now, it looks like an inner HTML call, but I've pre-processed the message that I'm going to display using this function call to static HTML. And hopefully that's an intuitive name for this function. What it does is, in fact, walk through all of the content of that message and look for anything that's script or script-like and strip it out while leaving any of the static HTML tags that aren't going to undermine user confidence in your application. And so in that particular case, you can see that even though it's bolded, because there are bold tags in place, there's no on-mouse over event that's being triggered when I move my mouse over that statement. Well, that's good. Okay, so what about this last option? This is the one that's going to be least familiar to you, and it's going to look a little bit strange and a little bit scary. This MS_a exec unsafe local function. What is that? Well, let's pop over to the code for a minute before I show you what it does in real life. This is how I call it. You can see these other operations I've done with just inner HTML, inner text, to static HTML. That's what I was just showing you. And then this last call here is the MS_exec unsafe local function. Well, what is that doing? Well, you can see that it's wrapping a call to inner HTML that's exactly like the call up above, except it's put in this separate inline function. This is the way that you signal the platform to say, I, in fact, expect script content to be included in this operation, and I expressly want to avoid any of that filtering or blocking mechanism that we would have in the platform, and I am okay with the script being included in my application in this operation. So this is the way that you get your behavior to be identical to the behavior that you otherwise would have had in the web context. It's going to operate in a very standards-based way in this context. So why did we give it this long, scary name, exec unsafe local function? Well, we did that very deliberately because we wanted you to be thoughtful about how and when you use this operation. Because if you use it loosely and frequently throughout your application, particularly in places where third parties might be able to actually manipulate that content, you've exposed yourself and your user, and consequently your user's data and resources, to some unknown third party. And nothing is going to undermine user confidence faster than having a vulnerability like this in your application. And so we want to enable you to do anything you think is necessary in your application while giving you a default experience that helps you avoid accidentally including script when you didn't intend it. So let's see what happens in the actual application. So here, as we saw before, the on-mouse over is in fact functional, and they're able to take control of the iframe. Now remember, this other element is running in local context, but I've told it I want it to operate just like it does in the web context, which means this script is in fact functional. And again, I kind of put a little bit of a scary message up here, assuming that some attacker has found a way to inject some unsafe content into your application, and just reminding you, if your app has access to these user resources, that now the attacker has access to those same resources and could begin to upload them to his or her website. And so please, use this function with caution, but do what you need to do in your application to provide the capabilities your customers expect. Okay, so that's an illustration of how the script filtering works for inner HTML and those related calls. But this is a little bit of an artificial application that is not something really that I would be proud to show. So let me show you some other examples. I wrote this application. Anybody read my bio? I don't know if anybody's reading those bios in the conference application. Well, Jerome, you don't count. Jerome works next door to me. He raised his hand. But if you read my bio, you'll see that I'm very interested in photography, not just digital photography, but film photography as well. And I do a fair amount of travel, one of the pleasures and joys of life. And I generally am taking my camera with me. And so I like to go back and revisit these photos. And so I created this little app that illustrates the usefulness of web context and local context to access some of my local resources and some remote resources and interact with them in a way that is useful to me and I would hope would be useful to some other people as well. So I have this application that reads my local picture library. So it's using the Windows runtime. Again, we're running in the default local context, so I have full access to the Windows runtime. So I can read these photos. And then I'm calling out to the Bing Maps API in a web context in order to interact with this useful map so that I didn't have to go build that all myself. So I can scan through these photos, a picture I took in Thailand up in Chiang Mai, another picture along the coast of France, and interact with both my local content and my local resources and web content and web resources. And so let me illustrate for you again. Portions of this application are running in local context to enable me to use the local resources that are provided through the Windows runtime. And another portion of my application is running in web context to allow me to interact with this dynamic AJAX control that I'm pulling down from the Bing service. These two things are working together using postmessage to send a communication every time I update to some new photograph. I identify what that photograph is. I use the Windows Runtime API calls to go read the data from the extended information, the EXIF information in the photo to get the longitude and latitude coordinates. I put that in a string, and I send that over to the web context where I'm able to process it there and update the map. So that's sort of the shape of this application. Let's look and see how I actually built this application and what it looks like when we step through it in the debugger. The first thing I want to do is just orient you to how I have loaded my HTML in local context and web context. As again I mentioned before, my default.html is loading directly from my local package, and again, by default, your application is running in local context. So this HTML file and its associated scripts are running in local context by default, and I have just a few divs that we care about. One is the title div, where I'm simply displaying photo map. There's this flipper view div, where I'm actually going to construct using the Windows JavaScript library that flipper control that I'm going to then populate with my local photos. We'll see how that works at runtime. I have an iframe here, and this is what I want to call out in particular. This is my map container. And you'll notice that I've used ms-www-web. And as you've learned by now, that's a way for me to signal that I want to load content from my local package, trusted, signed content that was written by you as the developer, but I want to load it in the web context with the web rules so that it can interact with remote scripts. So I reference it using ms-www-web map.html. And then I have a final div here, map data, that is what allows me to display the geographic names that I'm actually going to go get through a separate XHR call to the Bing service as well. Those other divs down below, those are just the divs that I show and hide when I'm showing you local context versus web context and really aren't part of the core part of my application. So let's take a quick look at map, because this is the local content, again, that I've said I want to load it in a web context. It's a very simple body there. There's one div statement that's just going to be the container for the map that I'm displaying. But there's a couple of other important things here that you'll notice. You'll see that I've highlighted a reference to script that's actually coming from an HTTP location. And as I mentioned before, that wouldn't be permitted in the local context. That's what we use web context for. That content that's coming down in that control is expecting to function the exact same way that it functions in a browser today, but it's going to be displayed in a local application. It needs to work in a very standards-based way that doesn't necessarily need access to the Windows runtime, but it needs to function appropriately in this application. So because I've loaded this particular HTML page using ms-www-web, it's allowed to interact and bring down that remote script. The second thing that I've got is a script reference to my own code, again, loading from my local package, that's going to allow me to process and receive those messages that I'm sending from local context and interact then with that remote AJAX control to update and reposition the map. Let's step through the code now and see how this actually functions. First thing I should do is turn on my breakpoints. Otherwise, it will be tough to see. Okay, so my application has activated at this point, and hopefully you've seen in a few different sessions this Win.js application on main window activated function. This is the notion that before my DOM is even fully loaded and fully complete, I get this activation message, and I'm able to begin to process some of the content in this DOM. The first call I'm making is to the JavaScript library again, Win.js UI process all. As you've heard in some of the other sessions, or if you didn't attend any of the sessions on Win.js, I invite you to go back and watch some of those videos. This is local JavaScript library that, in fact, is going to take that div that I identified earlier as a flipper control and actually construct that control, but it's going to be empty at that point. It's not bound to any data. And so this call that I'm making now, called load pictures, is where I'm going to show you that, in fact, because you're running in local context, you're able to interact with the Windows runtime. So stepping into that, I'm simply reading a demo folder that I have in my picture library. So if I bring up my Pictures Library, you'll see this demo folder, and there's a small list of pictures from some of my travels around the world. I'm going to read this set of folders. I'm going to create a data source from these folders, and I'm going to bind that data source to the Flipper control. And I'm able to do all of this because I'm running in local context. So I set up my query to the Windows storage search APIs to go find the particular photos that I'm interested in the photo library. Let me just step through this. Set up my query options, set up my data source options. Here you see I'm attaching to the Windows storage known folders picture library location. As you've seen in some of the other talks, there's capabilities that you may need to declare to enable access to the user's resources here. Just to show you in this case, I've checked off the internet client. That allows me to go out and talk to Bing. And I've checked off the picture library, which allows me to access the user's local photos. So stepping back into the code, right here, I'm going to go through and attach to that picture library, and then I'm going to drill down into the demo folder. And as I step through this, I'm going to wire up a new data source using the WinJS UI helper function that allows me to create an appropriate data source from the data that I got returned by the Windows runtime. Then I'm going to find the Flipper element using getElementById Flipper view and get the control. And then I'm going to bind that control to the data source that I've just created using the Windows runtime. The last thing that I'm going to do is add this event listener for page selected so that I can tell when the Flipper control actually loads a new picture so that then I can take the appropriate action to read the data from that file and post the message over to my web context. So let's see, if I continue the application at this point, what's going to happen is it's actually loaded all of those photos now, it's attached them to that Flipper control using the data binding, and the first photo is in fact being displayed at this point. So I've gotten this event, page selected. And now I'm in my handler for this event. What am I going to do with it? Well, the first thing that I'm going to do is, again, use the Windows Runtime APIs to load that file and read that file directly and get the file properties, including this extended data for the longitude and latitude. I'm going to step through that. Oops. Didn't mean to continue at that point. We'll go ahead and restart this so I can walk you through this. Step through, load pictures, load my query, query the subfolder. In handling the page selection message. And now I'm going to, yep, I've got my data, good. I'm in my handler for the page selection. I've gotten the longitude and latitude by reading it from the file properties. I'm creating this object photoloc, and then I'm going to do two things with that. I'm going to send a message over to my web context to let the map know that it should update. And I'm also going to make an XHR call out to Bing to get the geographic names. And I'm going to do those two operations asynchronously. So we'll see how this works. OK, step through. Let me step into Notify Map so that you can see that I'm really just making a very straightforward call to post message, sending it over to the other iframe where it's then going to be handled. And in a few seconds, we'll actually get that message on the other side, and we'll be in that handler. The other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to update the geography names, and I'm going to do that by making this XHR call to a Bing API that allows me to just pass the longitude and latitude, and it will give back to me the geographic names associated with that longitude and latitude. I do a little bit of parsing on that to make sure that I can format that correctly. And then I do an inner text call. Remember when we talked about safe operations for including the content in your local context? You have several different options. In this case, I'm never expecting any HTML content, no HTML tags, no script content, so I'm just using inner text to display that content below the map. When I continue here, I think I'm going to be over in my map.js handler for that message that I sent over to the web context, and that's where we see where we're at. Okay, so the first thing I'm doing over here in map.js is I'm checking to see whether that message actually came from the frame and the document that I expected it to come from. So I see that, yes, the origin is, in fact, that local compartment code coming from, that local context code coming from my local package. And then I'm going to check and see, is it, in fact, the kind of message that I was expecting it to be? So I'm receiving a photo location message. That's awesome. So now I can know I can actually take action on it. So the first thing I'm going to do is set the home location on the map. Again, this is my code from my package interacting with this external third-party content that's been pulled down into my MetroStyle app to allow me to interact with it. So if I step into this code, you'll see, first thing I do is I parse the longitude and latitude, and then I'm calling the Microsoft Maps API. So Microsoft Maps API isn't part of the core platform in Windows. It got loaded because of that script reference that I showed you earlier in that maps.html document. So now my application is legitimately interacting with this remote content, but doing it in a way that's safe and protecting my users' local resources and improving their confidence in these applications. So I set the map location, set the push pin, step through. Then I won't step through all of this code, but I'm going to recenter the map and zoom the map. And now, if I turn off my breakpoints, disable my breakpoints, and continue, we're going to see that the maps are in fact updating. Now you notice there's a Bing error here. That Bing error is because I was stepping through the code, I was stopped in the debugger, I made this asynchronous call out to Bing, and in fact I wasn't processing the messages that came back, so I don't actually have any content there. But as I step through and update, we're going to begin to see those actually come alive again. So in fact, let me then remind you that the way we've built this application is using local context and web context together with messages to allow us to build an application that users are going to be interested and excited about, gives me full access to the Windows runtime and interact with those user resources that they've given me access to and have trusted me with, while at the same time I can interact with any remote content and remote scripts that I need to enable the experiences in my application. So you can do all of these things bound together using post-message and deliver some really fantastic applications. Let me pop back to my PowerPoints here now. We have a couple more things that we're going to do. So first thing I want to talk about is just recapping where we were at with what we learned about local context and web context. Again, just as a reminder, local context guys, you're one of my favorites. So I give you full access to the Windows runtime. I'm also watching your back about how scripts are used in your application. And so we help you avoid accidental inclusion of untrusted content, but we enable you to do anything that's necessary as long as it's intentional and on purpose. And so web context guys, we love you too, and you're really also our favorite. We love all our children, right? And so we've enabled you to work just like the browser works. You may not have access to the Windows runtime, but you're cooperating with the guys on the other side of the room to provide any of the interaction with the local content that's necessary to deliver these applications. So that's all really cool. What about when the services that you're interacting with, in fact, require some form of authentication? Let's just see how easy we've made that. So there's some other sessions today that talk about live and single sign-on and some of the cool things you can do with the live services. Those are awesome sessions if you're interested in how live works in particular. Today, in this session, I'm really just going to talk about OAuth as the other popular mechanism by which you interact with many of these services. And the key thing that I want you to understand here is that there's really a very simple mechanism and API to do this authentication. How many of you have done OAuth in your apps? A few people? Was it easy? I'm seeing heads go like this. No, it's not easy. And because many of these services have in fact implemented OAuth in slightly different ways, there continue to be a few minor differences in how you interact with the different services, but we've abstracted as much of that as possible and pulled it off into a system broker that enables you to make a single API call to create the authentication experience in a way that's uniform and consistent for your users and that they can trust. Let's see what that looks like. Actually, let me ask, how many of you have loaded up Socialite or Tweetorama and you've seen the login screen? It's kind of a green band that goes across the screen. Yeah, that's the OAuth call, and it's done using a single function call. Let me show you what this looks like. Okay, so we're back to my demo machine. And let me pop over to the web authentication SDK sample. And for those of you who aren't familiar where the SDK samples are, I really encourage you to go up to the MSDN Development Center. There's links here on this site to samples. And these samples, in fact, show you all kinds of examples of how to do things in JavaScript and in the other languages. And you can see we've got 146 different samples just for JavaScript. And if I was to search for OAuth here, you will see there's this web authentication sample. This is going to be very useful to you if you are in fact doing OAuth to any of the popular services. And this is in fact the sample that I have brought up here in my demo. So let me run this, and we'll see what this looks like. So here we've got, in this SDK sample, code that you could cut and paste that shows you how to use Facebook, Twitter, Live, Google, and Flickr. And all of these end up showing a very similar user experience. So if I launch the Google authentication, I see a page that allows me to enter the Google content. I get that green dialog that appears and the opportunity to authenticate. If I close this and connect to Live, again, I get a very simple and consistent user experience and the opportunity to access the Live site. Let me close that and actually step you through the Facebook one. This is the same call that Socialite makes. So the first thing that happens is I need to do two things. I need to construct the URL that says, here's where the authentication is going to begin to happen, and each one of these services have a slightly different structure for what that URL looks like. It's well documented, and in fact, we've given you the examples in the SDK about how to construct exactly what these services need. Facebook has a very particular structure, so we're going to create that. Then we're going to declare the API that in fact, sorry, not the API, the URL that in fact Facebook is going to return when it says it's completed the OAuth request. So we give it a start location, an end location, and as you'll see in a minute, we're going to give it a couple of callbacks. So let's just step through this. I'm going to construct that start location. I'm going to construct the end location. And again, I'm skipping through the details about exactly how Facebook constructs it. You can go look at the SDK sample yourself to see how it works. And then I'm going to assign those to the start and end URI, set a little debug message in the SDK sample. And then this is the key call that I want to call to your attention. So it's in this deep namespace, Windows Security Authentication, Web Authentication Broker, Authenticate Async. But really, it's just a simple call to authenticate async. I'm giving it the start URI that says, here's where I want the authentication to begin. I'm giving it the end URI that says authentication has completed. Now, it might have completed successfully or it might have completed unsuccessfully. And then I'm going to give it pointers to a couple of functions in my own code to execute whether it succeeds or whether it fails. And this is really all you need to do in your application to do OAuth. So if I step through this, I'm in fact going to bring up the Facebook logon, and I'll go ahead and, if I can type, jhazen@microsoft.com, and I'll go ahead and type in my password, but I won't say it out loud, because while you look trustworthy, you're not that trustworthy. Oh, I closed. Sorry. I meant to say OK. Let me launch that again. continue. Type this one more time. Oh, now I'm using my home address. Now you know how to contact me. Oh well, too late. I guess I trust you more than I thought. And I'm going to log in this time. Oh, incorrect email. Okay. Let me try one more time. I almost thought I was going to get through this demo without any, demo gremlins. The only thing I want to show you is successfully logging in so that you see that I access the right return. Okay, so save device. Yay! Now I've successfully logged in. It only took 3 tries. Forgive me. And I'm calling the Facebook web authentication that I pointed to for success. Okay, so let's pop back for the review slides in the deck. Okay, so that was my demo. Web authentication broker, simple invocation, consistent user experience. One of the things I want to call out is because it's a broker, one of the good things is your application doesn't have to worry about potentially compromising the user credentials because the system's managing that for you. What you're going to get back is a token from the broker, and you don't have to worry about finding some safe way to store the username or password. This improves customer confidence in your applications. Finally, there was some great samples in the SDK for you. So very quickly, I want to recap. Dynamic content enriches your applications when used wisely. Customers expect it, but if you don't use it wisely and you abuse their trust, you're going to undermine customer confidence in your application, and none of us want that. Windows 8 makes it easy to separate code you trust from code you don't trust. And we've built on some familiar concepts like iframes and postmessage to enable that in your application. Windows 8 provides simple mechanisms to authenticate to some of the great services that are available that you want to interact with and that your customers want to interact with. And so my call to you is to really go build some great apps, build user confidence. There's a couple of other sessions that I want to call your attention to in particular. If what you're interested in is now taking the next step and learning how you take your website and move that into a Metro-style app using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and do that using some of the techniques that I've talked about today, you can actually stay here in this room, and Jerome Holman and Ray Bango, who are back there getting all excited about the talk. They're very entertaining guys, and there might even be some dancing involved. These guys will walk you through how to do that in real time here on stage. They're just going to walk you through transitioning a website into a HTML, into a Metro-style app built using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. If, on the other hand, you're interested in going deeper into what security practices look like writing these kinds of applications, David Weston is going to be over in the Marriott in Ballroom 9, I believe, in the next hour, in the next session as well. And you can go even deeper into some of the concepts that I've talked about today and learn even more about how to build customer confidence in your applications. I've got a pointer to a white paper that we've written about how to go do this in your conference app. When you get the PowerPoints available there, you can click through on that link and read that white paper. The last thing is we're out of time for taking questions here from the stage, but I'm going to hang out here for a few minutes and take your questions. But if I'm not able to answer all your questions here or you think of questions later, we have these forums up on the developer website where you're welcome to go up there and begin to interact with us. I'm up there active on the forums, so are many other people from the team. We would love to talk with you and get your questions answered. So again, I want to thank you for the time here. I want to thank you for the apps that you're going to build. I'm excited to see them. So thank you.